Good afternoon and good morning for some. This is Jennifer Joyce with Conducive Technologies. I am the Regional Vice President of Sales for the West and got a little bit over a decade here at Conducive. So I'm really looking forward to covering how we can help everyone on the call today boost SQL performance with our software-only solution. And I'd also like to take a moment to introduce my partner in crime here today, GQ. GQ?
Well, thank you, Jen, and I'm glad to be here. And don't let Jen's title fool you. She's very technical minded, but I'm here to handle the deep dive questions. One thing I do like to say, Jen, is that we always like to make these sessions interactive. So you'll see a question box over there. And if you have any questions during or at the end of the sessions, please put them in there because we do like to make this interactive. Thanks, Jen.
Yeah, great to have you, GQ. Thank you very much. So we're going to go ahead and start with the next slide here, the company overview slide. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but it's always good to know who we're talking to. So we are a 38-year-old software company. And I've been trying to do the math to convert that to dog years, software years. We've been around a while. We are actually the 12th oldest software company in the world. And I want to call out what I like to refer to as some of our scouting badges here around the around the perimeter of the slide. Specifically, I want to focus on the fact that we are a Microsoft Gold partner, and we have been since the beginning. Very proud of our partnership as with VMware as well. And we also just recently received our Citrix Ready certification. But one that I really want to call out here, and maybe GQ, if I could just ask you to speak to this for just a moment, is our Microsoft SQL Server IO Reliability certification.
Be glad to, Jen, and I consider this a very nice accolade here. Microsoft has certain certifications or reliability programs to make sure that third-party products like ourselves are fully compatible and reliable with theirs, and in this case, SQL Server. Not only did we have to do very stringent testing, we also had to go against a panel of SQL experts, and we passed with flying colors. Uh, we are actually the only software vendor to have this certification, but we're in good company with hardware vendors like EMC, Dell, and HP. So it's nice to know that we are fully compatible and certified for SQL Gen.
Yeah, it was a really nice feather in our cap, I will say, and thank you for letting us know about that, GQ. We're just going to jump right in here and go on to the next slide, get right into content. So, we really are here today to talk about how to improve SQL performance. And I would say that the vast majority of our clients that come to us and become customers initially do so because of SQL, some performance issues, user complaints, that type of thing. And the majority of our customers, though, once they use it in their SQL environment, they realize what it can do for any other application running in a Windows context, and they tend to expand licensing to their entire enterprise. But if we look on the next slide here, just specifically at SQL, we've been doing this survey for the last 5 or 6 years now, and we have been asking this key question of, in your SQL experience, is it bad enough that you're getting complaints? And 28% of respondents are saying, yes, it's bad enough that we're getting active complaints. So if you are on this call, chances are you've got a lot of company. You're in that 1 in 4 out of all the companies out there that are having issues like this. And we're going to go into the next slide here. We've got some quick high-level results, which we can replicate in your environment. This is using Intel's iometer with and without velocity. What we're really about here and what we're going to focus on in this call is how do we increase data transfer rates? How do we get more work processed in less time? And how do we demonstrate that in your environment, and how can you benefit from it? That's what we're really going to be talking about today. So if we go on to the next slide, we're going to see here kind of starting with a high level view of what the issues are. So this is interesting because, obviously this is a rudimentary extraction of what's happening in a real world environment. And what you have, I think the main takeaway from this slide is that you have IO characteristics that are much smaller, more fractured, more random than they need to be. I guess you could kind of call this the perfect trifecta for bad storage performance. It's sort of this death by a thousand cut scenario. everything's running, but it could be going faster. And a lot of times we take an approach of, well, let's throw more hardware at it. Um, and a lot of times that results in disruption. It results in a lot more expense than needs to be there. It can be premature. And even if we're upgrading hardware on cycle, maybe we're buying 10 pounds of hardware when we really only need to be buying 8. Um, and something that comes up a lot too is just the headroom we get in today's architectures. Like a lot of people will come in and say, hey, I've got 100,000 IOPS and I'm only using 10% or less of that. Well, let's take a look at this. I'm 5'3", so if I walk into a room, it's really crowded. Room's got 20-foot ceilings, and my goal is to get from one side of the room to the other without touching anybody else. All that 15 feet of free space above my head does me no good. That headroom is useless to me. I still have to navigate the 5 feet of space that everybody else is standing in with me. Now, if what we want to do is we want to actually have that room kind of empty out and get organized, and then it's easier to walk through. So we're going to be focusing today on that 10% of IOPS that most people or less are using, and how do we get that portion that's actively being used in processing your active workload right now today to go 30 to 40% faster. Now, if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to kind of highlight a couple of things here. So there's really 2 levels of inefficiency that we're dealing with. The first one is the Windows I/O tax. The second one is the I/O blender effect. So I'm going to talk about the Windows I/O tax first. As you can see in this illustration, what we've done is we've eliminated the Windows I/O tax from one VM, but not the others. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about what that Windows I/O tax is in a few slides, and I'll ask GQ to elaborate on that a little bit. But suffice it to say, I think we all know that the way Windows is treating files, it really is breaking up that file profile into a much smaller, more fractured I/O profile than it needs to be. If you just clean that up on one VM, great. That relationship from data from that VM to that host is now streamlined, but you have all the data from the neighbors creating the pressure of the I/O blender effect, aka I/O contention. So that's an issue. So one of the things that we want to do is if we go down to the next slide, I'm going to give you an anecdotal that we did recently on a customer with a proof of concept. This is what we really want the environment to look like. Healthy I/O, large sequential reads and writes from all data sources, eliminating the I/O blender effect. And a perfect illustration of this, as I mentioned, was a proof of concept we did with a financial services company just recently. Their scenario was they had 2 different clusters. One was 6 hosts with all their SQL VMs, 120 SQL VMs, and they had all their web and their app servers carved off into a different cluster. So the SQL cluster is what we focused on, and they had one client with one large SQL server that they were missing a monthly SLA on, and it was costing them quite a big penalty with that client every month. So they wanted to go the approach of the previous slide where they just deployed to that one workload, and we let them know it's not going to work. We can already tell you this proof of concept will fail if you're only deploying to that one server because of all that I/O pressure coming in from all the other servers in the environment. We went ahead and agreed to do this in phases. So they deployed to just the one server, it didn't work. The next month, they deployed to 10 heaviest I/O servers in that cluster, and for the first time in over a year, they made the SLA by 3 minutes. The next month, the software was removed, and they missed the SLA by 5 minutes, and they went, all right, we're going to go for all out on this. And they did this on the 4th month. They put us on 119 of the 120 servers, and they made the SLA by 17 minutes. It really illustrated very clearly the power of the I/O blender effect, and their change control is very tight. At the end of this 4-month process, they were able to validate that we were the only major change being made in the environment during that entire time. So it's very, very powerful, not to be underestimated. And GQ, real quick, one thing that I just wanted to mention and touch on is what we're really dealing with is not necessarily just less I/O. We talk a lot about I/O reduction, but what's really happening here is in order to have less I/O, the individual IOs all need to be larger. So you've got kind of that combination. You're still doing a gig of data, but instead of doing it in 100,000 IOs, you're doing it in 70,000 IOs. But GQ, another thing that's really interesting too, and I was wondering if you could touch on, is the fact that the nature of the IO is literally transforming from random to sequential. And could you touch real quick on the importance of that?
Of course, Jan. Not only are you reducing the workload of the operating system because there's less IOs to have to process. For instance, as you said, 70,000 IOs rather than hundreds of thousands of IOs. You also look at the storage too. Storage gives you two benchmarks, one for random IOs and one for sequential IOs. And you'll notice that the sequential IOs always outperform the random IOs. So by enforcing, if we can enforce nice sequential IOs, you're getting the optimal performance of your storage. And this is true for hard disk drives and SSDs, Jen. So
Yeah,
thanks.
it really is. Thanks, GQ, for covering that. So I just really wanted to kind of reemphasize those three factors all play together. It's not just the fact that there's less IO, it's also the fact that you have larger IO and sequential IO. And that's where we're getting the magic of that 30 to 40%, if not faster, data transfer speed improvement. So let's go. And guys, as well, we do have that dialog box for you to drop questions, and we're going to be starting to get into a little bit more of the technical aspects of how we do this. So please don't be shy, drop your questions in. We will definitely have time for Q&A at the end. So let's go ahead and start getting into some of that technical stuff on the next slide here. This is one of my favorite slides. It's called the top of the stack slide, just to emphasize where we sit. So where do we sit? Now, the orange bar that you can see there sitting kind of nested right inside that OS box, we are fenced by the Windows OS. Velocity is a 100% software solution for Windows. So I'll kind of preempt any questions. Is this for Linux or any other type of workloads? It is not. It is Windows focused. And it really is comprised of two light filter drivers. We'll talk about what those are and what the engines do. And I think the other really important thing here is to talk about compatibility. Because we are sitting where we are, we only have to talk to Windows. And if you think about it, storage is not talking directly to Windows either. There's too many abstracted layers. If you think about it, there's not a flavor of Windows for Dell or Windows for NetApp or Windows for Pure or anything like that. Everyone has to be compatible with receiving whatever Windows sends out. So we are also compatible with Windows. It gives us complete compatibility. But I think the third major takeaway on this slide, besides being 100% software and compatibility, is the fact of the top of the stack aspect, where we are really handling IO at the source, and we're treating this at the source rather than treating it lower level with symptom handling, which is what hardware really has to do because it's totally on the receipt point. So that's really interesting. And what we're really focused on is alleviating 30 to 50% of all of the IO from even having to go down through the stack, down through the network, down to storage, and having to have that SAN controller sift through all of that small fractured random IO that was natively created by Windows and transforming the nature of that IO to that larger, fewer sequential IO, getting that 30 to 40% faster data transfer rates. So that's kind of the high level of where we sit. Now let's jump into the next slide here. And we'll talk about just a quick preview, and then I'm going to ask GQ to really elaborate on what these two engines are. So the first one is our write optimization engine. And this is going to be how we eliminate 30% of all write IOs. And keep in mind, how it writes is how it reads. So if we're able to eliminate 30% of all original organic write IO, then the read requests will reflect how it wrote. So that's the engine that is actually doing the conversion of that small fractured random IO to that larger, less sequential IO. And then the second thing that GQ is going to cover is talking about how we establish a tier 0 caching strategy by leveraging the idle available DRAM that you already have sitting natively on your servers to serve hot reads. And we'll dive deeper into that as well. And then lastly, we'll go over kind of our central management console, how you can get reporting, how you can manage and deploy the software. And then we'll go into the handoff of the free copy of Velocity that you'll be receiving as a thank you for attending the webinar, and how you can test this in your own environment. So that kind of lines us up for the second half of the webinar, and then we'll take that Q&A. So GQ, let's go ahead and hop in. If you would do me the favor of covering our IntelliWrite engine, I'd greatly appreciate it.
I'd be glad to, Jen. Now, our first technology is called IntelliWrite, and it handles the write IO inefficiencies. As Jennifer indicated before, with something called the write IO tax, Windows, when it writes out data, doesn't know how big that file is when it gets created or extended, how big it's going to be. So it tends to write out in small little pieces. And that means small random IOs, many of them rather than nice sequential. So our IntelliWrite does something very unique. The patented technology actually, we're monitoring your system in the background, and we know when certain apps or certain file types, when they get created or extended, how big they're going to be on your system. And we feed that intelligence back to the file system. So when it does a create or extension, it can find the best allocation and write it out in a nice sequential IO. And as Jen indicated, that means 30% fewer IOs. Rather than 100,000 IOs to write a 1 GB file, it could be 60 or 70,000. So you can see how we decrease the number of IOs. And that also helps with the bandwidth of your network too. As you can see in the diagram, and this is a very simple one, instead of 4 IOs, it's now a nice one sequential IO. Of course, when you read it back too, the same thing happens. Now you can read it back at nice sequential IO. And as I said before, you're also getting the optimal performance out of your storage because sequential IO always outperform the random IO on either hard disk drives or SSDs. So that's our first technology. And I'd like to go into our second technology here, and that is IntelliMemory. This is our caching technology. And caching has been around for a while, but we're very unique. And actually, 9 out of the top 10 OEM PC manufacturers have actually licensed our technology. That's how unique we are. Now, there's several things that make us unique, but let me talk to you about the caching, why that provides you with the performance. With caching, when a read comes through, if we can satisfy that right at the operating system, you can see we just reduced that IO having gone down the network to the storage to get satisfied. Also, you can see how much faster it's going to be, so we cut down the latency time. And of course, without those extra IOs going through the network, we just increase that bandwidth for other people to use that network. And many of you may say, well, doesn't, my SSD, my storage has caching down below. But you have to remember the caching happening at the operating system, at the RAM. RAM is 10 to 15 times faster than the than the SSD. So you're getting that speed plus the reduction of it not having to go down network gets satisfied. So that's how caching helps you. Of course, we're right there at the operating system where the IOs get created, so we can get to satisfy them right there. Now, what makes our IntelliMemory unique? Several things. One is our dynamic use of memory. Other caching products, you have to go and allocate memory for it. We do not do that. We'll look at your system and see what memory is available and not being used by others, and we'll use that for caching. Now, if any user or system process comes in and needs it, we dynamically give it back, so there's never any memory contention issues. The second thing is how we determine what to put and keep in cache for optimal performance. Many caching products use a first in, first out type of pattern recognition. That is, oh, this data was just read, so let me put it in cache and hope that it gets read again. We take a more heuristic approach, and that is we are monitoring to see what data is getting read the most. And of course, that's only one factor. And that determines, let's put that in cache because that's more likely to get read and hit again. The second factor is we know that certain patterns of data will give you better performance than others. And that's another rating that we put in there. Using those two, that's why we're able to get such high cache hit rates and performance hit rates from our caching technology. And the third thing, as I said, our caching is right there at the virtual machine where the IOs are getting created. With all that, we're able to reduce the number of IOs have to go into storage. And as I said, it's going to increase your bandwidth and also give you the performance gains. Sorry, I got a little long there, Jen. I love talking this technology.
No, it's all good. You know what? I think GQ, we're doing such a good job of covering this that nobody has any questions because there's no questions in the question box. So seriously, guys, if you guys do have questions, please do pop those in because I'm sure there's going to be some. So we will have the Q&A session coming up here in just a moment. But thank you very much for covering that so well, GQ. And here we've got what this kind of all looks like. So this is what our velocity main dashboard page looks like. There's a bunch of other reports in here as well, but we'll keep it pretty high level today. And so we've got here, just kind of looking at the IO elimination, which again, we emphasize it's not just the elimination, it's the change of the nature of that from the sequential to from the random to the sequential, excuse me. But you can see here kind of average results. Read IOs, we typically are in a sweet spot of about a 50 to 60% elimination. Write IOs, 30% elimination on average is our sweet spot. We kind of translate this for you into some additional value add of, how much storage IO time does that equal to savings? If we go to the next slide, you can see as well another report as in our console, which is a global report. And this report will show you server by server the optimization numbers. And this can also be extracted into a CSV file so you can manipulate the data external to this. But you'll see like we'll give you a yellow or a red alert if we feel that we could do more for you if you added more memory to that system. You don't have to, but if that system's important to you, it'll give you recommendations on how you can get the most out of the system. Really, the main focus here is that we are looking at server-side optimization. Let's utilize the local resource within the server as much as we possibly can before you have to send it out and consume the valuable resources external to the server. So we'll go on here to look at the next slide, just kind of starting on the home stretch here of how do we do the handoff of the software over to you guys? What are the best practices for evaluating? So here you can just kind of see a high level of a summary of some of our case studies. We've got over 20 case studies published on our website. You can go check those out. These are just some highlights. I'm just going to touch on one of these in the upper left corner, Chris's Health. Their case study is one of the resources you can download, and they were at a point where they were 18 months into the life cycle of a SAN, and their electronic health records performance was really struggling, and it was so bad that they actually had a PO for $2 million to do a forklift upgrade of their backend storage sitting on the CIO's desk. And they were still searching for answers even while that was going through the procurement process. They came across Velocity, tried us, put us on 350 servers, and they completely recovered the performance and canceled the PO. And that's a really good example of a premature upgrade that they really just didn't need to spend the money on. And I realize that, we do need to buy hardware, but that's 18 months, that's just not really where we need to be doing it. So that's just one example, and they ended up actually expanding to their entire enterprise. They're now sitting on over 2,500 servers, even beyond their EHR environment. Another slide coming up here is going to just show us some common benefits that most of our customers do experience. They do just get better application stability and performance, faster data transfer rates, extending hardware life cycles. Big one, especially in SQL world, is reducing timeouts and crashes and just getting faster queries. So going down now, how do you actually do the proof of concept with us? How could you engage with us? First of all, our proof of concept process is free of charge. So we will do a free pre-POC consultation, and that'll involve a free assessment IO tool that we have, which I'll show you a screen of here in just a moment, the full proof of concept itself, and then when the proof of concept is done, wrapping that up and providing you a written technical executive summary of your experience with Velocity, and we'll incorporate information both from our consoles and reports and any third-party data that you've shared with us that you've done before and after testing with. Now, one tool that we can start with is shown here on the next slide, and that is our free conducive IO assessment tool. I love this tool because one of the things that really will highlight for us is if your servers are good candidates in the first place or not. It's a non-intrusive tool. It just uses remote WMI calls to get existing perfmon data from your target server. So you're not having to install anything on those target servers to do this assessment. It's very non-intrusive. Once we've collected the data from your target servers, we'll be able to use the reporting, and you'll be able to see it on your side independently as well from this to go, okay, these servers are good candidates or they're not, why? And then we can also assess ahead of time if the memory footprint on the servers looks like it's enough to be successful. If not, we can make some recommendations. That's typically the reason we mention that on this webinar is because we're focused on SQL. And we do realize that a lot of people have not placed a memory limit on SQL. So SQL is permitted to take all the memory in the system. We're not going to get in the way of that. So if that's the case in your SQL servers, then Velocity will not have room to cache and it'll sit on the sidelines. But because Velocity's caching algorithms are so much more sophisticated and efficient than the SQL algorithms are, it's a really good idea to place a memory limit and allow some room for us to play. So this pre-assessment tool will allow us to do the measure twice, cut once, and have a very efficient proof of concept experience for you. So again, that's a free tool that we can provide to you as well. So let's go ahead and go down to the next slide. And we'll talk a little bit more about, oh, I've already kind of touched on some of this, got ahead of myself, but when we do your proof of concept, the best things we want to do are make sure that we have evaluated with the IO assessment tool how much memory you have. If we want to make any adjustments, make the adjustment, let that settle, and then go ahead and deploy Velocity and come back a week later to see what we have. And of course, we'll have a online conversation as part of the proof of concept process to kind of determine what you're trying to accomplish so we can make sure we baseline the correct things before you deploy. So very straightforward. And if we go down to the next slide, the next steps for you guys are going to be to download the free conducive IO assessment tool. So if you want the tool, because it's not something that we normally just send out, if you want the tool, go ahead and type into the chat box IOAT. And before you do, I'm going to give you some options here of what to type into the chat box. So you can type in IOAT. You can also type in VMC, Velocity Management Console, or you can type in both. Everybody on the call is going to be getting their free copy of the software. But the reason that you can get either the IOAT and or the Velocity Management Console is because I highly recommend that you do your assessment with the Velocity Management Console, your trial, and keep that free copy in your back pocket. Don't use it up to try the software. That way you can keep that free copy and deploy it to any server you want in the future. It can go on a production server, physical, virtual, something in the cloud, doesn't matter. So now go ahead and start dropping in what your preferences are. You can have IOAT, VMC, or both, and we'll make sure we get you after the webinar what it was you wanted. So GQ, I think we've covered it all. We wanted to make sure we stayed in that 30 minutes to respect everybody's time here today. The last thing too is that we can also schedule a call with a conducive engineer. So you can also type in call if you'd like to go ahead and already schedule that proactively. So GQ, I am wondering if you see any technical questions for answering. My question box is not expanded properly, so I'm not actually seeing the questions. I'm going to try to make that adjustment. So I'll turn it over to you in case you see those already.
Jen, I do see questions coming in, and as I like to say, no question is a bad question. So let me start diving into this here. First of all, Pat here asks, does this need to be installed on the host or the VMs? Pat, this has to be installed on the virtual machines itself, not the host. And the reason we do this is the virtual machines, that's where the application, that's where the IOs are getting created. So we can optimize them right there where they're getting originating. That's where we can get the utmost performance. And then there's a follow-up question here too by someone else that says, is this required to be installed on all the virtual machines? And no, it's not. You can just install it on the one virtual machine that you're having the big IO bottlenecks with. But we recommend, as Jen indicated, install it on all of the virtual machines on that host. Because although you're increasing the performance gains of that one virtual machines, the other ones are still causing noisy IO across that host there and down to the storage. So you'll get optimal performance by installing on all the VMs. Now, Jen, here's a question for you. Someone asks, how is this licensed? So could you handle that one, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So Velocity is licensed in a couple of ways. We provide a lot of flexibility. You can license this either by individual server or VM, or you can license by host. Now, we don't install on the host, but we do. But when you license by host, it gives you the licensing entitlement to deploy to all of the VMs in the environment. Licensing is perpetual, and then you would get maintenance software upgrade assurance along with the perpetual licenses.
Thanks, Jen. And then I see Skip asks, will Velocity work in an environment where the data store resides on the same server application? Yes, it will. It'll do uh, work just fine on that. And there's another one question that is a little farther down, but let me handle that because it's related here. Does this just help performance of SQL, or what about other types of databases? Yes, Jed probably has some other success stories on other types of databases. And although we have just talked about SQL, it's really anything that is IO intensive. We get great performance gains on file servers, Exchange servers. Anything that is IO intensive, we can give performance gains. And anything to add to that, Jen?
Yeah, just anecdotally, two things popped into my mind immediately. Now, I mean, I do proof of concepts all the time, and I see the results on all sorts of different applications. Two that popped into my head instantly. One was I was just working with a client recently who actually inherited our software, had been deployed in that environment for a good 10 plus years. We had stayed close with the account and made sure that they were always updating to the newest technologies. And the woman I was speaking with about 3 weeks ago who inherited this, she actually took over 3 years ago and she'd been diligently upgrading it. But one day she says, what is this really doing for me? And we were really going through it. We were talking with her about it. And this was fascinating. I hear this a lot, but the light bulb went off. She goes, my old environment, we used to have to go through this whole checklist of manual defrags, and we had to do, remove temp files and clean all of that stuff up. And if we didn't do that, we would start getting this glitchy stuff. She goes, I've been here for 3 years and I haven't had to do any of that once. And I've never had performance complaints. And she goes, this is it. This is the difference. And it really, it was really crystal clear for her. The other example that comes to mind anecdotally, GQ, is how people can do this. A lot of people go, well, besides your tools, what can we test with? Well, we have people test with Intel's Iometer. We have people test with vSphere and VROPs. People have done testing with SolarWinds. So any tools you have in-house are fine. And we just had one recently where they were testing Citrix terminal servers, and they used vSphere, and they picked some perfmon counters that we recommended and used vSphere to measure it. And by the end of that, they were looking at about a 32% improvement in their read traffic and 18% in their write traffic. And it made a big difference because they're a huge shop. They had 200 terminal servers. So they went ahead and licensed for 87 hosts and did their whole environment. So it really can be easily demonstrated, and there is a lot of material benefit for the software.
Thanks, Jen. And yes, I do recall several customers, they look at the IOPS that are occurring at the SAN level. And what they notice is the IOPS actually decrease because of our caching. We're
Mhm.
satisfying it so it doesn't have to go down there. So they gain that optimal performance.
Yeah.
So uh, perfect, Jen. I have another question here about the safety of our caching. What happens if the system uh, actually gets powered down while you're caching? Well, what's nice about ours is we're a read caching technology. And that means is the data that is in our cache is already on your storage. So what happens is it's already safe on your storage. If the power goes down, this data is already there. Data integrity is our top goal here. So we always keep that in mind.
And GQ, real quick on that too, is that one of the things that people ask a lot about that is that we are talking about caching, just to emphasize that our caching is read only. The writes are all passed through. There is no buffering of writes taking place. And I think a lot of people ask that question because of that right there.
You're right. And then I see Pete says, and maybe you can handle this offline with him, but he says, is it licensed per VM or what is the list price? I
Yeah,
think you
Pete.
go ahead, Jen.
Yeah,
Sorry.
definitely. So, oh no, sorry, GQ, I jumped in too quick. So yeah, Pete, that definitely we can send you pricing offline because we do have volume license pricing. So it depends how many VMs you can license by VM or by host. and then we'll customize that for your environment. We can provide you both quotes so that you can see what's more economical for you.
Thanks, Jen. Uh, Steve here asked, what about physical systems? And Steve, you're right. We've been talking about the virtual environment here, but the physical systems have that same I/O tax problem. They even have that I/O blender effect too. Look at many physical systems all going to different LUNs on the same SAN, and that creates that same I/O blender effect. So we give the same performance gains on physical systems too.
And GQ, real quick add on one, I just wanted to note the time. We did finish all of the content within our 30 minutes. We're in the Q&A. If anyone has to drop off, we are recording the session. If you want to hear the rest of the Q&A and you have to go, please, you will get a recording. If you need to drop off, go ahead. But on that point, GQ, really interesting on the physical systems. We also get a lot of questions. People are going to hyperconverged and they're like, well, is it relevant? Yes, it absolutely is, because of a lot of what we talked about of sitting at the server side optimization within the OS. So whether it's a physical workload, a tiered storage, an all flash, a hyperconverged, or even the cloud, and I know that edge computing is coming in now because of just the cost of being in the cloud, and people are trying to offload a lot more of that back to their data center to kind of share that workload and reduce that processing cost. All of those are very relevant for what we're doing. So just wanted to throw that in as well, GQ.
Oh, great. Because I forgot about that. So thanks for pointing that out, Jen.
Yeah.
Thank you. Uh, Joe here asked, can this help backups? Actually, we've had many people where the backup window, it was exceeding their backup window. So we've had our people install our product, and it does help decrease the backup times. And Jen has many success stories on that one too. And here's another one. You talk about servers. Can this help desktops? Yes, it can. Those same, on any desktops that are I/O intensive, we can help on there. In fact, is VDI environments. We've helped people increase their performance in VDI issues too. Uh, Anything on that one, Jen?
I wanted just to touch back on backups real quick, and then I'll mention on the desktops. On backups, it also will depend if you're block-based or file-based, and if you're doing incrementals and that type of thing. So on the backups, we want to see specifically what the nature of your specific environment is to know if Velocity can help based on configurations. But on VDI and desktops, yeah, physical desktops, very much so, get a lot of extra years of life out of that. And there's definite benchmarking tests we can do on that environment for you as well. In addition, like GQ said, to the VDI. And VDI is even more prone to this because you tend to increase the amount of density, and you can go, way more than how many server OSs you have. And that IO contention, that blender effect really, really starts baking in and kind of caking things up. So definitely very relevant environments for doing proof of concepts in. And in a VDI environment specifically to benchmark, because most are using non-persistent state VDI clients, we would actually use VROPs or some other tool like that to get our baselines on key perfmon type metrics to be able to do the before and after. So in that one, we'd be pretty much totally reliant on third-party tools to show your baselines. So that was what I wanted to add. Thanks, GQ.
No problem, Jen. And Hemsudar asked, how much resources is it going to take? There's a couple things on that, Hemsudar. One is, as I said, our caching technology will only use what's available and not being used. So if your system or user needs it, we give it back. In terms of our background tasks, I indicated in the background, we measure, or we're looking at saying when a file gets created or extended, how much it's going to be. We actually, not only are we running at lowest process priority, we're actually have some other technology we call invisitasking. And that is, even when the Windows schedules us to run and we're running at lowest process priority, we'll take a look at what resources are being used out there. And if, for instance, there's some IOs on the queue, we'll back off and let the user and system, any other process run first. So we're very proactive on being zero impact on the system there. Good question. And you know what, Phil just brought up a question, and we didn't touch about it. Jen, is he asked, how does velocity work in the cloud? For example, AWS. Do I have to be using a VM in the cloud, or will it help if I'm directly using a cloud database? Good question, Phil. Actually, if you're running infrastructure or platform as a service in the cloud, we can get installed on those systems and help you out in those cases. Uh, if you're directly using a cloud database, it depends on how that database is presented into your system. We may or may not help in that case, but platform and infrastructure as a service, we have many people doing it using our products in those cases there.
That's great. GQ, do we have any other questions coming in?
Just one more here, Jen.
Okay.
And one person asked, how do I manage many deployments? Or is it, I install on each one of these systems? We actually have something called the Velocity Management Console. And from a single pane of glass, you can deploy, manage, get reports of all your deployments of Velocity.
And
And
it's
go
also
ahead,
a,
Jen.
yeah, it's also a .msi file. So we have a lot of people choose to deploy through SCCM, SCOM kind of solutions, and then we can use the Velocity Management Console to discover the installations after the fact and still get the reporting. So either approach is totally viable.
Let me just take a quick look here, Jen. Uh, I think we've gotten all the questions. That was great, guys.
Yeah.
The only thing I just want to say, if you think of anything else later, don't hesitate to send it in. And myself, one of the sales reps, one of the SEs will respond back to you. So thank you, Jen.
Yeah, thank you, GQ, and I really appreciate all the Q&A, guys. Today was a really great dynamic chat, and we'll make sure that everyone who typed in both or your requests for what follow-ups you wanted gets those. So have a fantastic day, and we look forward to having you test out Velocity.
Thank you, everyone.